I have finished The Hobbit now, from the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit box set. When I started this box set, I made a 30-minute long video, which was more or less a long apology for never having finished The Lord of the Rings before. And I don't want to repeat all 30 minutes of that video. I'll link to it in the description down below, but just briefly, just a very quick summary. My history with The Hobbit. I grew up with the animated Rankin Bass movie, which was on the Disney Channel in the 1980s, in which we videotaped when it was on the Disney Channel onto VHS, and so saw that multiple times in childhood. I attempted to read the book as a kid, at about fourth grade or something. And I got into the first chapter and realized that the book contained a lot of details that the movie did not, and details that seemed to me to be needlessly boring. So, like in the movie, they meet Bilbo meets Gandalf and he meets the elves, and they set up on his quest very quickly. I'm talking about the Rankin Bass movie, not the Peter Jackson movie. But you know, in the book, that chapter 1 just makes such a big deal of introducing Gandalf and the dwarfs, and I just lost patience with it very quickly. I came back to this shortly after I finished college in 2001, because I wanted to read the Lord of the Rings books, and I figured I should start with this book. And I did read this back in 2001, but my memories of it were not fond, the memories were mixed. I loved the story, and I had always loved the story, because I was familiar with that from the movie, the Rankin Bass animated movie. So that is something that had captured my imagination as a kid. The goblins riding on wolves, the giant spiders, the elves in the forest, the Smaug the dragon, all of that stuff. But when I came to read the book cover to cover, I felt like it was a bit of a slog getting through it. The story I already knew, and there were a lot of just boring details and description that I wasn't interested in. So that's my history, which brings me up to date for the reread. I loved this book, rereading it, even though I had felt like it was a slog when I read it 20 years ago. Rereading it, I really enjoyed it, and I was able to get immersed in it, and I was able to get into the atmosphere of it. Yeah, I think part of the reason for the change, well, I mean, one thing is maybe I've matured a bit as a reader. I would like to think so. I mean, it's a children's book, so I know I'm not claiming any big accolades by saying I was able to finally get into the atmosphere of it. But I think 20 years ago I was an impatient reader, and especially as a kid I was an impatient reader. Just had no patience for details and setting, and perhaps I've matured slightly. The other thing I think is enabling me to enjoy this book more now is thanks to Wikipedia, which wasn't around 20 years ago, but thanks to Wikipedia, I have a better idea of where this book lies in the history of fantasy as a genre, and I have a better idea of what Tolkien was doing. Um, you know, basic stuff, I guess, which it seems like everybody knows now, but perhaps wasn't basic knowledge before Wikipedia and before the internet as we know it today, about how Tolkien was a scholar, and how he had, was familiar with all those Anglo-Saxon poems and Beowulf, and how he was integrating that style and that tone into this book and into these books in a way that set the template for the fantasy genre as we know it today. That kind of stuff I was ignorant of and didn't appreciate it. And now that I know about it, or know something about it, I know that the writing style and the atmosphere and the way that this story is told, almost as if it were an old legend, is what you're here for. It's not the boring details. It's the meat. It's what makes this book. Of course, though, it's not simply told in the style of Beowulf. It is very much told like a modern novel, with just some trappings of old epic legends or old old style of writing overlaid over it. But it is very much told like a modern novel, and I think that interplay is what makes this book interesting. Now, my understanding is that The Hobbit was a children's book, and then The Lord of the Rings were aimed at adults, and the Lord of the Rings were even more sophisticated in the way that it was drawing on those old Anglo-Saxon legends. But The Lord of the Rings will be for another day. There is still some of this in The Hobbit, and enough that I enjoyed it. So, while I was rereading this, I did my best to avoid looking at clips of the movie on YouTube. Just tried to forget about the movie as much as possible. It's unfortunate that the edition I have here is the movie tie-in edition, but that's the only edition that was being sold at my bookstore, the bookstore here in Vietnam. In Vietnam, selection is limited. And just tried to enjoy the atmosphere as much as possible. It's interesting. Ordinarily, you would go to a book to get all the details that weren't in the movie. And there are a lot of details in this book that were not in the Rankin Bass movie. Whole subplots and characters, like that shapeshifter Bjorn is his name, the guy who can change into a bear, or stuff with the necromancer, which it doesn't figure prominently in this book, but is mentioned. Stuff like that was, to the best of my recollection, not in the Rankin Bass movie. Actually, I've got to be careful before making sweeping pronouncements, because I haven't seen that movie in like 30 years or something, 35 years. But to the best of my recollection. However, the Hobbit is now an interesting case because of that 9-hour Peter Jackson trilogy. There's actually much more detail in the movie, if you watch the Peter Jackson movie, than there is in this book. So I guess in that case, you're not reading the book for the extra detail, but you are reading it for the atmosphere, and the little tinge of ancient legends that Tolkien has been able to put in this book, where it feels like a much older and mystic world. And there are a lot of examples about this. When they talk about the goblins, and then they make reference to the Goblin Wars and the fighting in the mines, and these are all things that had occurred before this book had started. Or when it talked about the land of Dale and what it had been like generations ago with the king under the mountain, and the runes here. Sorry, I'm not sure how this map is going to show up on the video. Often this camera will show it in reverse image, but maybe you get the idea even so. And yeah, there are a few illustrations in this edition, which I think, here's another one, I think must be from the original book. I'm not sure. Here's another map. There were a few times when I got a little bit confused by some of the geographical descriptions, particularly talking about like the course where the river flowed. Not that I really needed it to follow the story. I mean, I already knew the story anyways. Even if I didn't, you know, all you need to know is there's a river. You don't need to follow the description of it. But yeah, I don't know. It's a children's book, so I don't know how much I should admit to struggling with the text of it. But some of those geographical descriptions about the course of rivers and riverbanks and where things were in relation to the rivers, I didn't get a clear picture of. And I don't know, I reread those sections a couple times, but I didn't linger on it because they weren't essential to understanding the story. Some of the descriptions of the mountain as well, when the dwarves were climbing up the mountain looking for the secret door, exactly where on the mountain face they were. Tolkien's descriptions lost me a little bit. Yeah, I don't know what other people's experience with this book was, but none of that was essential for understanding the story. Yeah, it's just kind of a by the by description. Oh, by the way, sorry, this is maybe a little bit late in the review to mention this, but the assumption I'm going to be making during this review is that everybody knows the story already. You've read the book already, or if you haven't read the book, you've seen the movies. So I'm not going to try and recount the plot of the book or what happens. I'm just going to comment on the reading experience. And if you've read the book, maybe you can chime in and tell me what your experience was reading it. Yeah, speaking of that, the Battle of the Five Armies, which in both the Rankin Bass movies and especially in the Peter Jackson production, was a big deal. I was rather surprised to find out in this book that it had the feel of being an afterthought. So when the dwarves get into the mountains, and then the army of the elves and the army of the men march out to argue with the dwarves, that's all set up quite well, and feels like it has appropriate pacing and appropriate description and character development and depth. But then the goblin army just appears out of nowhere. It's just like, oh, and then here came the goblin army. I mean, it is mentioned, you know, that they had heard about the death of Smaug and stuff like that, but we don't get really any foreshadowing of this huge goblin army coming up until just like a couple pages before it comes, and then the pacing of the book changes very quickly. Whereas before, kind of scenes would be more drawn out. Then the whole pacing of that battle is described in only a few pages, in which there's a lot happening, which is described, very with very few words. So you get it almost seems like it's from a different writer. I'm reminded of some of the pulp fiction books where the action moves at a much quicker pace. Seems like the whole coda with the Battle of the Five Armies felt like that. The goblins are defeated, of course, as you know, and chased. Yeah. Where's the section with the goblins? So, Bilbo actually gets hit on the head and misses most of the battle. Thorin Oakenshield gets mortally wounded off screen. and as a brief death scene where he says goodbye to Bilbo. The other elves, Fili and Kili, die completely off screen, and in fact, their death is really brushed over. After Thorin dies, then there's just a brief thing. Then oh, by the way, Fili and Kili had also died defending them. Which is just mentioned briefly by the narrator when he's wrapping up all the things that had happened during the battle. The dwarves in this book are largely forgettable and interchangeable, although Fili and Kili are two of the dwarves that are mentioned more than the other dwarves because they're portrayed as being the younger ones and not as grumpy or stuck in their ways as the other people in the dwarf company. But that having a little thing that distinguishes them from the rest of the dwarves does not save them from being killed off screen and just being mentioned very briefly at the end. And then after they defeat the goblins, there's a section here. Where is it? After they defeat the goblins, they chase the goblins into the swamp, and there's a section about how they slaughtered a bunch of them in the swamp. Here it is. Sorry, I should have marked up some of these passages out before I started filming, huh? But yeah, there's a section describing how they defeated the goblins at the end, and then they were chasing them into the swamps and hunting down the last of them and killing the few that remained, which struck me as Old Testament, like those God's command to go kill all the Amalekites, don't let any of them remain alive. Seems to me that the same idea is with hunting down these goblins. Now that the goblin army is defeated, just kind of hunt them down and kill as many of them as you can, which, to be fair, according to the history books, seems to be how a lot of ancient warfare went on within the Old Testament or outside of the Old Testament. But it's definitely a different ethos than the way that the dwarves and the men and the elves treat each other. They're very reluctant to come to blows with each other or to harm each other. But when it comes to the goblins, it's like kill them all down, hunt them all down, and kill them all. Which is perhaps an issue with this book, is that the goblins are just born evil. Sorry, I shouldn't say issue because it's part of the genre. Part of the old legends and myths are that there's these monsters who are just monsters and need to be defeated. So I don't necessarily mean that as a criticism. Maybe it's just part of. It's just it's interesting where there's no attempt made. There's no awareness within the book that the value of a goblin life is not equal to the value of a man or a dwarf or an elf life. Okay, that observation being made, moving on. Another thing that's interesting in this book, so this book, of course, talks about Bilbo Baggins and how he's got a nice little snug home where he enjoys his pipe and his tobacco and his fireplace and his warm slippers and his breakfasts. It's a type of book that, as you read it, you think to yourself, yeah, there is something to be said for being snug in your home. And quite often when I was reading this to myself, I thought, oh, yeah, I mean, I am sitting here on my couch, but am I as comfortable and snugly as I could be? Maybe I could be eating some bacon and eggs right now, or bacon and eggs something that pops up a couple times in the book as something characters fantasize about eating about. But eating some nice bread or a flagon of ale. Talks about sometimes beer and ale and wine. Um, the yeah the beer and ale and wine is mentioned briefly, and portrayed as a good thing or a comforting thing, which is interesting for a children's book. And I think this is a children's book, right? Um, I mean, not that we necessarily have to get all puritanical about this, but you know, it just seems to be a bit of a tease to mention all these adult things that children aren't allowed to have, and then make a big deal about that in the book. And then the other thing is tobacco. Um, Tobacco, of course, was not in ancient Europe. That came from the New World. And I think I've heard this mentioned as one of the more famous anachronisms in Tolkien's world. And I guess I imagine that Tolkien, in the 1930s in England, tobacco was such a part of his life that he couldn't imagine a world without it, and that's why it gets written in here. So, Gandalf is smoking his pipe and blowing his smoke rings, and Bilbo and the Thorin. And then when Bilbo gets lost in the goblin caves, he suddenly realizes he's got his tobacco with him. And this comforts him. He's like, okay, well, it's not all bad. At least I have my tobacco. And then he looks around for matches, and he can't find his matches. So his feeling of relief at finding the tobacco diminishes. But then he decides maybe it's just as well that I don't light the match when I'm in the dark here in the Goblin Cave. It could attract unwanted attention. But the point being that there's this interesting little point where he's comforted by the fact that he's got his tobacco, and the smoking the tobacco is going to make things feel slightly less bad. And then at the end, one of the very last lines, I think, is passing the tobacco bowl. So of course, I mean, I think in the 1930s when this book was written, tobacco was much more accepted. I mean, certainly, I've not read a ton of books from the 1930s, but like George Orwell's book also has his books also have like a tobacco fetish, or always talks about how wonderful tobacco is, and talks about it like it has restorative properties. Like if you're really sick or worn out, the tobacco will help you feel more normal again. But yeah, I don't know. All the same, a bit strange to give the pleasures of tobacco that much prominence in a children's book, maybe. I think this is another thing I picked up on Wikipedia. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I think Tolkien was the first person to portray elves as kind of woodland. What's the word I'm looking for? Woodland spirits, or kind of beautiful woodland nymphs, or well, nymphs are only women, aren't they? But yeah, kind of humanoid woodland spirits, rather than these small little gremlins who come out and make shoes during the middle of the night. Or I don't know, maybe he wasn't the first, but definitely that portrayal of elves is in this book, and then I because I've seen the movies, I know it will continue out into the following books. So yeah, the elf. There's a few different elf settlements they run into, which of course. I already said I wasn't going to recap the movie. Just going to comment on stuff that was interesting. Actually, maybe maybe this is a good place to finish the video. I think that's about going to be the limits of my commentary. I know I really haven't said much that's substantive or insightful about this book, but I, I don't really have that much substantive or insightful to say about it. The story has long been a favorite of mine since I was a kid. The style of writing has obviously taken me a few years to appreciate, but I think I'm there now, and I appreciated this book, and I appreciated all the allusions to things that have gone on before. Makes you feel like there's a much that this story has taken place in an older world that has some history to it, and Tolkien is very good at creating that atmosphere. I found it a pleasant, immersive experience, and in fact, I found myself regretting that never became a Tolkien fan earlier in my life. I don't know. We'll see whether that assessment still stays true after I slog myself through this trilogy. But I certainly had many friends who were big Tolkien fans and loved to get immersed in that world and loved to look at illustrations of different scenes from the books and got into the other books like the Silmarillion and stuff like that. And I thought while I was reading this, there does seem to be an immersive world here, which would be fun to get into, and perhaps would have been fun to get into 20 years ago, or even before that, when I was still in high school or a teenager or something like that. But for better or for worse, I just did not have the patience for this book when I was younger. So it was not a pleasure I was able to avail myself of then, but I definitely see the appeal of it now, coming to the table a little bit late. So next, onward with these. Fellowship of the Rings, I actually did as an audiobook 20 years ago, but felt like I did not absorb it fully, and certainly sections of it were difficult to absorb on the audiobook. And then the Two Towers I gave up on. So these will be much newer material for me, and those will be coming next.